Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the district's annual public hearing regarding the district's property tax rates to be set for the 2018 tax year. The district holds this hearing pursuant to state statute and also to board policy requiring that a public hearing be held prior to the board approving formal tax rates for the school district in the various classes of property. There's a notice that's posted at least 7 days in advance of the public hearing. That notice was published both in the Webster Kirkwood Times as well as online and at various district locations. The board policy and state law only requires one or the other. The district did both in order to be as transparent and informative to the community as possible. I appreciate the board making themselves available to have this public hearing in between board meetings. We typically would like to have a public hearing at a board meeting and then approval of the rates at a following board meeting, but given the board meeting schedule and the availability of information from the assessor's office in order to make the tax rate calculations, we didn't have that information from the assessor's office in time to do the calculations and provide a 7-day notice and still have this public hearing last week at the regular board meeting, so we needed to schedule something in advance. Technically, we could have had the public hearing next Monday, but that would have required the public hearing to be held and then immediately followed by a board meeting to approve the rates, and that seemed that we needed some time in between the two. So if there was any input from and questions from the board or from the community, the district would have time to respond to those. So in the public, the notice of the public hearing that was posted, I've put a copy of that at your seat, so you can refer to that. That's also, there were copies available back by the sign-in register, so if you didn't get a copy when you came in, you can grab one of those. Technically, this information is all that we need to review and go over to meet the requirements of state statute and board policy regarding the proposed tax rates for the 2018 school year and the distribution of those tax rates and revenues among the various financial funds of the district, the general fund, the teachers or special revenue fund, and so forth. However, in typical Webster style, we like to be a little bit more thorough than what the minimum requirements are. So we generally will go through a review in the public hearing to talk about a little bit how the tax rate is calculated and what factors went into calculating this year's tax rate as compared to last year's tax rate. One of the things that we note is the support that the district gets from homeowners. In particular, local property taxes provide, in an overall sense, about 2/3 of the district's operating funds, and 75% of those property taxes come from homeowners specifically. So if you did some quick math, took 75% of 2/3, it's almost half of the district's operating revenues come from residential homeowners. That's a fairly large percentage compared to other school districts that might have more commercial development, or other school districts who may not have a lot of development in their school districts and rely more on state funding for their school district operations. So it's important, the setting of the tax rate is very important to the district. There are 4 separate property classifications: residential property, commercial, agricultural, and personal property. Of course, the district long ago had the last of its agricultural property, so there is no property currently in that category. Residential property is assessed at 19% of its market value, commercial at 32%, personal property at 1/3 or 33.3%. Yes.
Your flow, Bruce, and if I've asked this previously, please forgive me. At one point in time during my years on the board, that there was some information that may have been that some of the country club property that falls within our district was actually considered agricultural from the tax standpoint. But is that not the case, or is it considered residential? How is that factored in?
Yeah, I can certainly state that it's not considered agricultural because there is no assessed valuation in the agricultural category for Webster Grove School District. I believe that that is assessed as residential property, and that may have been part of the controversy about whether a country club should be assessed as a business or commercial versus assessed as residential property, because obviously 19% of market value versus 32% of market value is a significant amount.
And I apologize, for some reason that had stuck in my head at
Yeah.
one point in time that there was some, because I would have debated the fact that it was even agricultural at that
Yeah.
point, because they're not growing anything. No offense to anybody
Grass,
who's
yeah,
a
maybe.
member of any country,
Sure.
but they're not growing anything.
Sure.
I recall that as well, Steve.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was a changeable law. It seems to me that was about 5 years ago that we were having this conversation.
Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I have to say that.
I appreciate your indulgence and your information. Thank you.
And Webster, being part of St. Louis County, we're in what's called a multi-rate taxing jurisdiction, which means we have separate tax rates for each classification of each of the 4 classifications of property. There are many counties and districts in the state, fact is most, that just have a single rate that applies to all property classifications. But in counties like St. Louis County or on the Kansas City side, St. Charles County, that have a substantial amount of commercial development where there's more likely to be protests in terms of values and challenges to the values, challenges to the assessors on those values, that can increase and that can decrease those property values significantly as it goes through the appeal process. And as that happens, as properties lose value from what was initially assessed, that can cause a roll-up in the tax rate. And if that applies to all properties, then you essentially have what can be perceived as the tax as residential homeowners shouldering part of the tax burden of a commercial enterprise. So in the more developed counties in the state, they have a multi-rate so that the commercial taxpayers shoulder the burden of commercial changes, residential shoulder the changes in residential property, and so forth. So we look at what the assessed valuations are prior year and current year. We look at what the prior year tax rates were. We look at what new construction has been by class. In reassessment years, odd-numbered years, we also look at the increase in values caused by the reassessment of property. And then we look at what the maximum authorized levy and tax and what the tax rate ceilings have been for the school district. And all of those factors go into essentially an electronic form that was created by the state auditor's office that calculates what the district's tax rate is. That's a much improved system where taxing jurisdiction years ago, they had the forms, but they had to do their own calculations by hand, and so that led to a lot less consistency and a lot more errors and mistakes than having that electronic form. So it's a pretty complicated calculation if you dig into it too deep, but just conceptually it's pretty simple. You start with last year's tax rate and you start with last year's assessed valuation. If assessed valuation increases, if that increase is due to new construction or in personal property due to personal property additions, then the revenue associated with that just comes is an increase in revenue to the district, doesn't affect the tax rate calculation. But if that increase is in the assessed valuation is due to reassessment, then to the extent that increase exceeds an inflationary allowance, the tax rate has to be adjusted for that excess increase. On the flip side of that, if assessed valuations are reduced, then districts can roll up their tax levy as long as they don't exceed any previously authorized maximum by the voters. So it's kind of a floating tax rate that floats up and down based on whether assessed valuations are going up and down when you take out new construction. The base core assessed valuation excluding new construction, as that goes up and down, then the tax rate goes up and down to try to compensate for that. And theoretically, that's to try to provide a more stable source of revenue within what the maximum previously approved by the voters has been. So as we look at this year's assessed valuation and how that compares to last year's to see, okay, what happened. This isn't a reassessment year, so as we look at changes, we expect any change in assessed valuations would theoretically be just due to new construction or property additions. So we look at 2017, we know what we set the tax rate based on September of last year when I was talking to you. These are the numbers, the original 2017 numbers that we based 2017's tax rates on. They were significant increases over 2016's values because 2017 was a reassessment year, and it was real estate values had been appreciating considerably. So it triggered that $620 million in residential, $100 million in commercial. Those triggered substantial rollbacks in the tax rates for those categories on the order of around 30 cents in those categories based on those numbers. However, when we looked at what happened to those values after September, because there were still appeals in the system related to 2017 values that didn't get decided until after September. So it was after we had set our tax rate, and some of these appeals go all the way to the state level, to the State Tax Commission, and go through a process that sometimes can take years to decide. So this past year, we had some decisions from the State Tax Commission that went all the way back to 2007 or 2008, and yet a school district is required to use whatever the current figures from the assessor is, even though a portion of those can disappear, a portion of that value can disappear in subsequent years due to State Tax Commission decisions. And in fact, that's what happened in 2017. Residential appeals were decided by the State Tax Commission that reduced 2017 values by 1.3 million and about $500,000 in the commercial category. So that was kind of our starting point, was, okay, now that we're a year later, where should we have been starting with 2017 values? And then so those numbers go in the first column here, and then we add new construction because the county tracks new construction. So we figure if we take those adjusted 2017 numbers and add new construction to it, that gives us what our preliminary 2018 number is. But when we compare that to actual 2018 numbers from the assessor's office, we can see variations there too. So in the residential category, for instance, we were almost $2.9 million short, even after accounting for the $1.3 million of appeals. And that comes from other kinds of adjustments that are made outside of the State Tax Commission, property that gets reclassified, property that used to be residential that becomes tax exempt, those kinds of adjustments. So there could have been some residential property that got reclassified as commercial, and that's why the commercial's a little bit higher and residential's a little bit lower. There could have been some also some property that was exempted, those kinds of things. But as we look then and set the tax rates, those factors get taken into consideration. Those losses get taken into consideration. So when we look at the tax rates here in a minute, we'll see some adjustments in the residential rate and the commercial rate that kind of reflects what we were just looking at there. But historically, to get a sense of, in particular, residential assessed valuation, we're taking a look at this from 2006 and tracking that forward. And you can see kind of the crash that happened in the 2009, 2010. We had been up to almost $600 million in assessed valuation, and then that drops off because of the housing crisis, and all the way down to $538 million. And you can see, if you look onto the far right column, you can see what happens in the tax rate as this is happening. And of course, in 2010, we had a tax levy increase that was approved. But even outside of the tax levy increase, you can see as assessed valuation tends to decrease, the tax rate tends to increase, and as the assessed valuation increases, the tax rate tends to decrease. It's that relationship that I was talking about before. And so as we look at residential value for 2018, we're at $619 million, almost $620 million in assessed valuation. Our total assessed valuation is a little over $800 million. So every penny of levy essentially contributes about $80,000 to the district budget. Which is just a few $100s per penny increase over last year, what last year's penny was worth. And the residential rate, property tax rate, is projected or is calculated to go up to 4.7955, up from last year's actual calculated rate in September of 4.7554. So that's a 4-cent increase. And what that 4 cents represents is an adjustment that compensates for the $1.3 million in reduction from state tax commission decisions and the $2.3 million decrease in exemptions and reclassifications and other kinds of adjustments that were made. This just illustrates a little more specifically, percentage-wise, what was happening in the residential assessed valuations, and you can see during years of decreases what the change, that there's usually a positive change in the tax rate, and during years of increases, there's a reduction to the tax rate, and it just kind of shows that correlation and what the CPI factor has been each year. For 2018, our proposed tax rates by property class, and this includes the debt service fund levy. So if you take the 4.7955 for residential and add 56.99 cents for debt service, that's where you'll come up with the 5.3654. Commercial property at 5.4623, which is up about a penny, and the personal property that it remains at $5.90 for the operating fund, and then adding the 56.99 for debt service onto that. If you want to see it graphically, we've got 4 different tax rates here. At the upper level, that's the personal property. That's not really subject to changes due to reassessment increases and decreases. So you see that's much more stable. It stayed at $5.91 until 2016, and you can't really see it in this graph, but there was a 1 cent reduction in 2016. Going forward for the voluntary rollback for the full-day kindergarten tuition when we went to state funding for full-day kindergarten. But in the residential and the commercial, you can see kind of how the tax rate has tracked over time. And that just kind of ebbs and flows. The last time we had a tax increase was in 2010, which kind of brought it up to the high point, and then it just kind of stayed around that level until 2014-15, or until 2015, which is when the real estate market started to recover and values started to increase. And so we've been rolling back the tax rate every other year, essentially, starting in 2015. And then the debt service rate is the yellow line right down toward the bottom that's been at 56.99 cents during pretty much the whole period. A sample calculation of a tax bill for a home that's market value of $400,000. It's assessed at 19%, as mentioned before, so that its assessed value is $76,000. The tax rate of 5.3654, which is all-inclusive, including the debt service fund. The property tax then due for the school district would be $4,077.70. Now, don't run home, look at your tax bill, think your house is worth $400,000, and expect your tax bill to be $4,000, because the school district is only one piece of your property tax bill. You've got the county, the city, the fire district, library district. I think the zoo district has a county-wide property tax. You have to add all of those on. It used to be that school districts were very closely associated with the property tax bill because school districts were generally 80% of your property tax bill. But over time, there's been more and more jurisdictions that have jumped on the property tax bandwagon, or however you want to describe it, and so that's kind of dwindled down to where, in many cases, a school district may only be 50 to 60% of a property tax bill nowadays. But people still associate their property tax bill with, this is my school district. It's hard to overcome that. In terms of the tax rates by fund, I forgot to change the title of the slide. It's 2018 proposed tax rates by fund. And then you can see by fund what the tax rates were in 2017, and then what they would be proposed in 2018, with the difference, the change in the tax rate going essentially to the incidental fund. The teacher's fund staying at $1.79, building fund staying at 6.25 cents, and the debt service staying at 56.99. The last item really is just a comparison to budget. You can go through the tax calculations, say, okay, that's all well and good. I kind of understand how the tax rate works and is calculated, but how does it look compared to our budget this year? So the original budget, operating budget, projected revenues of 38.973. And based on the tax rate that's proposed for the three categories, since we don't have agricultural, and the assessed valuations that we were given by the assessor's office, the calculation would come in at 38.969, so within $4,000 of what our budget is. I think it's 0.0009%. Very right on, or it's very close to budget, and it assumes a 97.7% collection rate. The tax rate hearing, you might look at that real quick and say, well, this says $44.5 million. Well, the difference is two things. One is on the tax rate hearing, it includes the debt service fund revenues, and this is just the operating revenues that we're looking at here. And the other is this assumes 100% collection. We're required on the public notice to assume 100% collection, and we know historically nobody collects 100% of the property taxes. If the best we can do is 98.5 because the county keeps 1.5% as a collection fee, and then there's always some loss due to delinquent payments or non-payments, and also the appeals. We don't, if values are being decreased, then they're only paying taxes on that decreased value. So if we based our projection based on the full value that we had at the time, there's always going to be a little slippage there too. But the 97, historically over the last 4 years, our actual collection percentage has been about 97.7 something, between 97.7 and 97.8. So the 97.7 is based on the most recent 4 years historical.
Bruce, I'm expecting next year to be much better than just $3,000 off when it comes to you have to set the bar high. Would you please reach that?
We'll work on that. We'll work on that. So I want to open it up to questions. Before I do that, I want to also just acknowledge and thank Joanne Kite, the comptroller. She was did yeoman's work in calculating and recalculating and recalculating these tax rates as information was updated and changed, and it was very much an odyssey this year to get to final rates here. These rates, by the way, have already been approved by, reviewed and approved by the state auditor's office. Usually at this time they haven't been, and so we have to say these are subject to state auditor's review and approval. We don't have to say that this time. But if for some reason between now and next Monday we happen to receive updated assessed valuation information from the county assessor, we would go back and recalculate the rates. But we don't expect that to happen. It's never happened in the past. So with that, I would open it up to any questions. Otherwise, the rates will be presented to the board for your formal approval next Monday.
More just something, just for a clarification. So you've talked about the rate for last year being 475. On the notice we have here, it's 476. Can you just spend 1 minute describing the updates that led to this number not matching the one that's on your earlier presentation?
Sure. That's directly related to the State Tax Commission decisions when we were looking at this page here, where the original versus the revised assessed valuations for 2017. The districts are allowed, and in fact, best practices and just districts generally will go back and recalculate the prior year's assessment and tax rates, simply because they're routinely changing the assessed valuations as appeals are settled and reductions to assessments are made. If we had known that 2017's final assessed valuation was going to turn out to be $618 million instead of $620 million, we would have set the rate at what you see on the tax rate form here. So this was adjusted up by a penny or so in order to compensate for the loss of $1.3 million in assessed valuation. And that revision is something that can be done not just for 2017, but theoretically, because State Tax Commission is making decisions that can go back 6, 7, 8, 10 years, districts can even go back that far and do calculations for losses in assessed valuation where they had rolled back too far. And then roll those all forward. But we just went back to 2017 and did that calculation.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I hope you know we do realize and appreciate all the All right, this time we do have an opportunity for public comment. If anybody would like to make a public comment at this time, we just ask that it be related to the subject of the time. All right, seeing none. Those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all for coming out tonight.
Heather, how are you? Thanks for coming. Well, regular board meetings, there would be a handful for us.